Within a week of his arrival at Durban, Gandhi was to go to Pretoria by rail. Though he had a first-class passenger ticket, he was not allowed to travel by that class as he was a colored man. He was thrown outside the compartment along with his baggage at the wayside railway station of Maritzburg. That was the turning point in Gandhi's life.
He needed to take some action. South Africa was dominated by a small group of white people who wanted to control the country and its economy. They decided to introduce the philosophy of apartheid and prejudice and discrimination. And Gandhi said that that was wrong. We should not submit to this kind of injustice. And so it was on September 11th, 1906, that he called upon the people to assemble to chalk out a plan of action. They met in a theater in Johannesburg. There were several thousand people who had assembled there, and all of them unanimously decided that we must take non-violent action against this kind of repression. He first called his campaign civil disobedience, and then he gave that up because he said there's nothing disobedient about what I am doing. And then he adopted Tolstoy's passive resistance and gave up that also because he said there's nothing passive about this. It's very active philosophy. And he launched a competition, and he invited the public to come up with a term that would define the entire philosophy. And so they ultimately resorted to the Indian language and came up with the term Satyagraha, which is a combination of two words, Satya meaning truth and Agraha meaning pursuit of. And so he liked that because he said that life itself is a pursuit of truth. Since then, his movement became known as Satyagraha. The changes that took place around the world because of Gandhi's philosophy of nonviolence is the fact that South Africa itself became free non-violently. The Soviet Union became free non-violently, and many other countries in the world have become free non-violently subsequently. So I think he's given the world a very important legacy and an important philosophy.
Wait, and go.
In the United States, nonviolent methods gained civil rights for African Americans.
My name is George Hauser. I have quite a lengthy past because I've just hit 90 years old. I was one of the founders of the Congress of Racial Equality in Chicago back in 1943 and served as executive director for 10 years from about 1945 to 1955. There's no doubt that Martin Luther King knew about CORE. One day, this small group went to a restaurant and they were refused service because there were blacks in the group. We had a lot of discussion about that and decided that we ought to take some action. We began to experiment with nonviolent action using direct action to oppose discrimination. We would have sit-ins. We had quite a large group of people that the whites went in first and occupied as many seats as they could, and then the first interracial group came in. They were refused service for an hour or so before they were finally seated, and then the second interracial group came in. And they stood there for a long time. The manager, the owner came out and called the police. The police came. No arrests were made because we were quite orderly. There was no violence taking place. Finally, somebody not connected with our group asked one of the black members of our interracial group to join them at their table. And then the management said, well, all right, sit down. So we all sat down, and the restaurant, which was filled with a lot more people than just our group, broke out into a wild applause. So it was one victory, and that was in June of 1943.
And go.
Some believe that nonviolence doesn't work. The truth is that it has worked for the past 100 years.
It was so incredible to go to a place where people are risking life and limb for democracy. You know, we met people who had been imprisoned for years, who had been physically tortured for years because they were a part of the democratic movement. It's such a wake-up call, you know, for people like us that come from a country where we can vote. We have the right to vote, and so many of us don't exercise that right. You know, we have the power to change things. And I thought I'd just read you a little excerpt from this book. It's called The Voice of Hope, and it's interviews with Aung San Suu Kyi. And he says, Dasu, that's her, the affectionate term they refer to her. How effective is nonviolence in the modern world, and more specifically with regimes that are devoid of sensitivity or any sense of moral shame and conscience? And she says, nonviolence means positive action. You have to work. You have to work for whatever you want. You don't just sit there doing nothing and hope to get what you want. It means that the methods you use are nonviolent ones. Some people think that nonviolence is passive. It's not so.
Hi, my name is Eileen Alardo. I'm a dental hygienist. Last year, it was shortly after Katrina, I heard about this medical dental fair. They were asking for volunteers, hygienists, dentists, all kinds of doctors. As soon as I got there, I was working within 15 minutes. The work was, they had this makeshift dental office set up in one of the buildings. I cleaned teeth. The people would start arriving. They were all victims. The people were wonderful. They were grateful for everything that was being done for them. I felt so inspired that I did that. That was something that was so outside of myself. Being a single mom, it wasn't an easy decision for me to make to take the time off from work. My original intention on going down there was to be sort of an inspiration for my children. And I realized that I needed to be the inspiration for myself, that we need to inspire ourselves in order to be any kind of inspiration for others. As Gandhi said it, to be the change you wish to see in the world.
On September 11th, I was basically living the American dream. I had married my college sweetheart. We had moved to a beautiful neighborhood and had 2 wonderful children, and I was pregnant with our 3rd. David traveled quite frequently and unfortunately was on American Flight 11 en route to LA when his plane was hijacked and he was killed. From the moment I found out about Dave's death, the generosity and support that I received was overwhelming. When the U.S. began to prepare to invade Afghanistan, it was my first time seeing the world of the Afghan people. Before September 11th, I couldn't have told you where Afghanistan was on a map. The images of the women covered from head to toe in the burqas, rendering them voiceless. And 90% of them are illiterate and innumerate. They don't know how to write their name. Most of them don't even know how old they are. It's so terrible and so tough to be a widow here in the United States. what must it be like to be a widow in Afghanistan? And I talked to a friend who was also a 9/11 widow. Hattie Quigley was the other co-founder about this idea, and she quickly jumped on board, and we formed Beyond the 11. And our mission is to help widows affected by war and terrorism in Afghanistan. And that initial wanting to help one widow turned into 500 widows, but also each widow has approximately 5 children, so it's about 2,500 kids that we're also helping in the process. One of the things that I strongly believe in is that it's not just this generation, but it's really educating the next generation if we want to make true change.
My name is Tenny Gross. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute for the Study and Practice of Nonviolence. The Institute was started about 6 years ago, in 2000. There was a murder of a young girl a day before she was to testify in court in a murder charge, and she was gunned down playing outside her home the night before. Really shocked the city. And the team ministry decided that they want to do something before the funerals. And they got to work with the culture. They got to change the culture. They got to use the tools that they know would be nonviolence, right? That policing is not going to solve it, that a lot of other tools that were at disposal of a city were just not working. We were losing a lot of young people. And they dedicated a former convent and what then became a rehab house and eventually was shut down into a place that will be the future home of the Institute. No doubt a part of it is really working together, really recruiting the media and the captains of the city to pay attention to youth and youth violence and youth issues. I mean, that's what it takes, really, attention, some love, and some consequences. But you can give out consequences when you provided love. Young people will listen to people that also show them they care about them. Then the chastising comes with the moral authority. Whereas if you don't show any love, your chastising just looks like empty punishing. When you inspire hope in somebody, you better be there to follow up.
For 18 years, I was a middle school history teacher. I taught world and American history. And every year I taught it through a prism of nonviolence and peace education. And every year my students would start out in class saying, "But Mrs. Graydon, nonviolence will never work. There are 6 billion people on the planet, and you will never get 6 billion people to be nonviolent." And then I had a thought, and I turned to the blackboard, because the population of India, when Gandhi brought nonviolent peaceful revolution to India, was 300 million. And I wrote 6 billion divided by 300 million, and even the most math challenged in the group could see that the answer was 20. And I said to them, we don't need 6 billion Gandhis. We only need 20 Gandhis. And there was this sigh in the classroom, and they realized that there were 31 of them there. So I said, 11 of you can go home and do nothing. And if the other 20 of you committed to nonviolent change in the world, we could bring that change in the world. We could create, with 20 Gandhis, the world peace that we picture.
When the question is raised about what the world needs to develop into a peaceful world, the first thing that comes to my mind is something that I learned in the African struggle. It is the Portuguese words, "A luta continua," which is translated as "the struggle continues."
Love.
Love.
Imagining.
Fearlessness.
Flowers.
Empathy.
Harmony.
Joy.
Education.
Beauty.
Peace.
was born to two immigrants who knew why they were here. They were happy to pay taxes for the schools and roads, happy to be here. They took it seriously, the second job of citizenry. My mother went campaigning door to door, and holding to her hand was me. Yes, I was just a girl in a room full of women licking stamps and laughing. I remember the feeling of community brewing, of democracy happening. But I suppose, like anybody, I had to teach myself to see all that stuff that got lost on its way to church, all that stuff that got lost on its way to school, all that stuff that got lost on its way to the house of my family, all that stuff that was not lost on me. Yes, teach myself to see each of us through the lens of forgiveness, like we're stuck with each other, God forbid. Teach myself to smile and stop and talk to a whole other color kid. Yeah, teach myself to be new in an instant, like the truth is accessible at any time.